Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to make a shirt. I'll be using Simplicity 1327, this Western shirt, and I'm also going to be taking the pocket pattern from Simplicity 4760. I'm going to be making a short sleeve option, and I've also changed the style of the yoke on both the front and the back pieces, which I'll show you as we go along. If you're making the long sleeved version, you can follow along with my other video on how to attach a shirt cuff with a continuous lap, and I'll reference that in the notes below. If you're attaching the pockets from Simplicity 1327, which include the pocket flaps and the button and buttonhole in the pocket, then you can also follow my video on how to attach a pocket flap to include a button and buttonhole, and that will also be in the notes below. I'm going to be making the shirt in this really lovely shirting fabric which I bought from Fabric Godmother. Unfortunately, this was the last 2 meters that they had. I think it's an ex-designer fabric, and it's got really tiny little apples and pears on the print, and it feels really, really nice, really, really good quality. I've cut all my pattern pieces out already, so you can see this is the front yoke that I've just changed the shape to make it slightly more straight, and this is the back yoke that I traced off and I've made that straight as well. The first instruction is to do stay stitching, to stay stitch the necklines, so that's what I'll begin with. Stay stitching the necklines of the back, the front, and also the yoke pieces. Stay stitching is a line of straight stitching which stays in the fabric, and it stops the neckline from stretching as you go through the construction process. I'm going to put my stay stitching 1.2 centimeters from the edge, so it's within the seam allowance and I won't have to take it out once I've made my seams. I'm using a stitch length of 2.5 and a back tack at either end. The next step on the pattern is to press under the seam allowance on both the yoke front and the yoke back, so that once that's been turned under, then these yoke pieces can be applied to the right side of the back and the right side of the front pattern pieces and then stitched into place. To give me a guide for my pressing, I'm going to just sew along the seam line on all of those yoke pieces. Now I've got my pressing line, I'm going to go over to the ironing board and press those in place. Now that I've turned under the seam allowance on these yoke pieces, although the pattern doesn't say to do this, I'm going to trim away a little bit of excess seam allowance, and that's just going to reduce some of the bulk when I apply these to the garment, particularly here where I've got a little bit of a pleat because I've got some shaping, and you'll find that's probably more prominent if you're actually using the shaped yoke on the back pattern piece. So I'm going to trim this to about 6mm, cutting off just over half of what is there currently. I'll start by applying the yoke piece to the back. Just match that in place. You'll have notches around the neckline. I've also notched the centre back. Pin that in place. And now I'm going to pin the front yokes in place. pinned all the yokes in place, I'm going to stitch them on across the style lines of the front and the back. I'm going to be stitching quite close to this fold line. The pattern suggests 6mm from the edge, but I prefer it to be stitched a bit closer so I don't get that kind of ridge flapping about. So I'm going to be about 2 to 3mm in from the edge. And then around the raw edges here, I'm going to be stitching, just using a long machine stitch within the seam allowance. So I'll be sewing about 1 centimetre in, using the longest stitch on my sewing machine to hold those raw edges together. Turning it up to a long machine stitch now to go round the raw edges. Now the yokes are in place, the next thing is the pocket. I'm using Simplicity 4760 pattern piece for the pocket, but if you're using the pattern piece from 1327, the principle will be exactly the same. We're going to start first by turning under the raw edge along the top to create a nice pocket opening. Then we'll press under the shaped edges of the pocket so it's ready to then attach to the front of your shirt. When I cut out the pocket, I just placed a tiny snip either end of the fold line to mark that ready for pressing and sewing. The first step is to turn under the raw edge along the top by 6mm, press that in place, and then fold that, turning it over to the right side. That will be turned under 6mm, and then you're going to fold along the fold line. Don't press though, just turn it along the fold line and then pin that in place. You don't want to crease along here because eventually that will be turned to the other side, and if you press it at this stage you might not get that crease out. So just iron this section at the top and then gently fold that over. I'm going to go to the iron and just turn under this 6mm here. Now I've turned this raw edge under, I've pressed it, flip your pocket to the right side and then find those notches for the fold line and just turn that over, putting the right sides together, and just place a couple of pins to hold that in place at either end. Next I'm going to stitch 1.5 centimetres in, so following the seam line, sewing around the edges of the pocket back up to the top again, keeping this edge open. Now that's sewn, I'm going to trim off some of the excess around the seam allowance. And like with the yokes, I'm going to trim away just over half. And on the top here, I'm going to just snip across that corner. So just cutting through that top layer so you can see that they're a different width trimmed from the edge, and then I'll do the same on this side, cut across the corner and layer that seam allowance. This just helps with the bulk when you turn it through to the right side. So now that's done, I'm going to turn this through to the right side, so I like to fold that edge under as I bring it through, and do that on this side, fold that edge under and then turn it through. It helps if you've got some kind of point turner tool, or a ruler is quite good. Try not to use a pair of scissors because you can end up poking the scissors a bit too sharply and sticking them through your fabric into the corner. So just press those out so you've got a nice corner, and then we're going to iron that flat and press under the seam allowance all the way round, making sure that the sewing line we've got there as a pressing guide stays to the inside and won't be visible once the pocket is sewn on. So I'll go over to the iron and press up the pocket. So the next thing to do is to just stitch in place the top edge here, or the pocket facing, and secure that about 2 or 3 millimeters away from the inner fold here. So I'm going to stitch along there, keeping the distance equal from the top edge, so I get a nice straight line across the top of my pocket. And now the pocket's ready to be applied to my shirt. I transferred the markings for the pocket here, so you can see, just about see, that I've got these red tails of thread where I've done tailor's tacks to mark the top of the pocket. So I can then place my pocket here, aligning the top 2 corners with those markers, and just making sure that they are actually straight according to the pattern. So you could do a bit of shimming around to get the correct placement, or if you decide you want to completely pattern match your pocket, you can just try and adjust the alignment slightly to pattern match, but I'm not going to bother doing that because this pattern's a little bit too busy. What I will do is I want to make sure that the left edge of the pocket is an equal distance from this edge here, so I'm going to just measure that and make sure it's the same at the top and at the bottom there. Okay, so now I'm happy with that alignment there on the left edge. I'm going to pin this in place. If you're applying a pocket to both the left and the right side of your shirt, you want to make sure firstly that your pockets are exactly the same size. Sometimes using a card template to press the pocket around can really help to give you the right shape. And then also when you're placing the pockets, make sure that they're placed exactly in the same position on the left and the right side. Okay, now that's pinned in position. I'm ready to sew this in place. I'm going to sew about 2 or 3 millimeters in from the edge all the way around. And at the top, I'm going to sew a rectangle as reinforcement. I'm going to start sewing from this point here on this line, stitch across the line and then up to the top, out to the edge, and then edge stitch all the way around, and then repeat it this side, stitching across the top and down to complete the rectangle at the end. I'm going to move on to the next stage of construction now, which is to attach the shoulder seams. When I edge finish, I'm going to cut off about 1/2 centimetre from the seam allowance so I don't end up with quite a big flappy seam allowance. I'm going to use the little bumps on the top of the presser foot here and just make sure that they will sit about 3mm to the right of my stitch line, and then I know I'm going to be cutting off not too much but enough. Now I've overlocked both the shoulder seams, I'm going to press both shoulder seams towards the back and then top stitch from the right side to give a bit of reinforcement across that shoulder seam. And the next step in construction is to add the sleeves. Make sure when you cut out your sleeves that you transfer the markings. So I've put small snips to show where the top of the sleeve is, also where the small dots were on the pattern. I've put another snip, and then make sure you transferred the notches so you know which is the back where you've got 2 notches and which is the front where you've got a single notch. I'm going to start by matching at the side seam and matching at the shoulder and the other side seam. This type of sleeve, shirt sleeve, should fit exactly into the armhole without needing to do any easing. You should find that your notches match, and then you'll be able to just place pins and put that into position all the way around. Once you've matched your notch and the top of the sleeve, then just find the middle point in that section of unpinned fabric and then place a pin in the centre. I find that's a good way to make sure that I don't end up accidentally gathering the fabric or stretching the sleeve out of shape. And then I'm going to do the same process. So go in between 2 pins and place a pin in the centre. Don't be scared to put too many pins into sleeves. Sometimes you'll find that it's much better to put loads of pins in than to sew the sleeve in incorrectly and then need to unpick it and put it in again. And now that sleeve's pinned in, I'm ready to sew them both in place. I've placed the pins on the sleeve side, and I'm going to start from the underarm seam, stitching over those pins, stitching from the inside of the sleeve. Have a quick check to make sure that your sleeve is inserted correctly, nothing is puckered. Yep, they look good to me. So on to the next stage, finish the seam allowance. I'm going to overlock again. Now I've edge finished the sleeve seams, I'm going to press the seam towards the shoulder and then top stitch like I did the shoulder seam. I'm going to top stitch the sleeve seam from the right side, stitching on the main part of the garment, not the sleeve. And now my top stitching's done. The next thing is to sew the sleeve seam and the side seam of the body all in one go. So we'll start with the pinning. Fold the garment right sides together, and then first of all match the sleeves underarm seam. Make sure that those seams are going to line up perfectly under there, and then pin that. If you're using a slippery fabric, you might actually want to tack that or stitch that position first before you do the whole long seam, so you can make sure that it is going to be perfectly positioned at the seam. And then once you've got that point anchored, and then you can just carry on pinning the rest of the sleeve, and then continue down the length of the side. I'm going to start by matching up the bottom. Check if you've got any notches, you can match those notches. And then, like I did with the sleeve, find a middle point and pin there. And then if you feel you need to, place a few more pins in the centre positions here as well. Because this is quite a nice, easy to handle cotton fabric, I'm just going to leave it with those 3 pins there. And then repeat for the other side. And now that's pinned, I can go over to the sewing machine and stitch that seam. Before I edge finish the seam allowance, I'm going to actually go straight ahead and attach the collar and the front band, and then do a quick fit with my client before I then do any edge finishing here, because I've got a feeling I might need to take it in slightly at the side seams. The next part of construction then will be attaching the front bands. You should have 2 front bands, and you will need to apply interfacing to either half of it, depending on the thickness of your fabric, or apply interfacing to the whole piece and apply interfacing to both front bands, because you'll need to reinforce the band which will hold the buttonholes and also the band which will hold the buttons. Both front bands are going to be applied in the same way, and we start first by stitching them to the wrong side of the garments, and then they're folded over eventually, so pinned to the wrong side here, and then they'll be folded over and then top stitched in place from the right side. Before I attach the front bands, I'm going to turn under the raw edge on opposite sides of each band. So this one I'm going to turn under that edge, and this one I'm going to turn under this edge. You may well have notches on your band. I seem to have lost mine, but what you want to do is you'll be turning under the unnotched edge, and then the notched edge will be used to help you correctly position the band as it's being applied to the garment. Now that I've pressed under the long unnotched edges of my front bands, I'm going to trim some of this seam allowance away to reduce the bulk once these are applied, like we did on the yoke pieces. And now I've trimmed, I'm ready to attach the bands to the garment. The band will be applied with the right side of the band facing the wrong side of the garment front. And you're matching the unfolded notched edge. And next, stitch those in place. Now the bands are attached, I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the band and then fold the band in half so that my folded and trimmed edge here just covers that stitch line. And you'll need to make sure that this is also, when you fold, that you keep an equal distance all the way down. When you press the band, just be really careful not to burn the interfacing. I'm going to put a few pins in to hold the front bands before I sew them in place so they don't move while I'm stitching. And now that's pinned, I'm going to stitch about 2mm from this edge and from this edge to hold both the folds in position. Now that the front bands are attached, the next thing's the collar. On your pattern instructions, it will tell you to interface one of each of the collar pieces and the neckband. So go ahead and do that. I've actually applied interfacing to both sides of the collar because my interfacing was a bit thin and I wanted a little bit more structure in the collar. I've also applied just one piece of interfacing to one side of the neckband. When you apply your interfacing, trim about 1/2 centimetre off all the way round so it sits within the seam allowance but not right up to the edges, and that will just help you to reduce a little bit of bulk when you're sewing. I'm going to put the collar pieces to one side for the moment and I'm going to take the interfaced neckband piece. Make sure that you've transferred any notches or any other marks. You'll have some notches along the bottom edge here, which is the straight edge. This is the edge we're going to apply to the garment first. And you'll also have some small circles to help you match the neckband to the shoulder seams. I'm going to match the neckband to the neckline, and before I do that I've snipped up to my stay stitching. What you'll find is that the seam line will match exactly to the seam line on the neckband, but because of the seam allowance it makes it quite hard to match that edge, so you'll need to clip in order for it to fit correctly. I'm going to apply the neckband and place my pins on the inside of the garment because I find that much easier to check that as I'm sewing the neckband on I'm not causing any puckering around the inner edge. I've placed a snip for the centre back, so you can find the centre back of your shirt. Place those together, so I'm going to pin the centre back and pin those notches near the centre back as well. When you're doing your clipping you might decide to actually notch out completely the triangles for these markers, and then when you've got your snips you don't then get confused between which are the snips and which are the notches. Once I've matched at the back you can then match your shoulder markings to the shoulder seams and also match round to the centre front. The neckband piece should extend from the seam line, it should extend 1.5 centimetres, so you can check that that does have 1.5 centimetres of overhang at the edge. And then once you've got your notches and your circles marked and your neckband hanging over the edge there correctly at 1.5 centimetres, you can go ahead and match the rest of the edges together and put plenty of pins in. And now the neckband stitched in place, I'm going to remove the pins and then trim and layer this seam allowance. Give the neckband a quick check, make sure nothing's puckered, make sure the seam's nice and flat all the way round. If you've got any puckering, you'll need to just undo those areas and re-stitch to make sure that it is nice and flat. So that's looking good. These seams are going to be pressed up towards the neckband, and what I want to do is just reduce some of this bulk along here, because I've got 3 layers of fabric in some places, and at the front here on the front band I've got more than that. So I will trim away about 0.5 centimetre from all the seam allowance to begin with, and then once I've done that I'll go back along and trim off to layer and reduce the inner edge again. And then this time I'm going to trim away the inner edge, taking about 2 or 3 millimetres off that. Now that's trimmed and layered, I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the neckband, pressing that up, making sure not to burn the interfacing when you press those seams that way. If you need to put more clipping in around the curves, do so that you want to make sure that this seam will sit nice and flat. The seam allowances have all been pressed and the neckband's now ready for the next stage. Take your 2 collar pieces, place them so that right sides are facing. We're going to pin those together, and then you're going to stitch, leaving this top edge open, which is where it's going to be attached to the neckline, and we'll stitch around here back up to the top. When you stitch the collar, you may want to mark your seam allowance, particularly where you're going to pivot in the corners. You want to make sure that both points of the collar are the same size and shape. Trim about half the seam allowance off, cut across the corner, just leave a couple of millimetres at the corner. If you've got quite heavy fabric, you might want to layer by trimming one of the seam allowances slightly shorter. I'll take this over to the ironing board, turn it right side out, give it a really good press. When I'm turning this right side out to press, what I try to do is to just open it out first and press the seam allowance to one side, again being really careful not to burn the interfacing, so make sure your iron's not too hot. If you're worried, you could use a pressing cloth as well, so I just want to push the seam allowance to one side. And then when you turn the collar the right way about, fold the edges over. So I'll fold that edge over, fold that edge over, and then flip it through. And then with them held, just turn that through to the right side. And then I've got a point turning tool that I can use to poke out that corner. And then when you're pressing the collar, roll that edge right out. You don't want to form any pleats around the edge. Roll it right out and give that a really good press all the way round. Now I'm ready to attach it. If you've turned your collar and you're looking at your collar points and you're thinking they're not quite as good as they could be, you've tried using the point turning tool and you're still finding there's a little bit of fabric there that needs to come out, you take a pin and then just ease that fabric out at that corner. If you can grab hold of a stitch in there, that can be a really good way of pulling that out. You can just tease that corner out so you've got a much better point. And then try that again the other side. So just use your pin to just tease that fabric out at the corner. Be really, really careful though, because if you get this wrong you can end up pulling the threads out. So it works best on something that's quite stable. Okay. Before I attach the collar, I want to just long machine stitch across the opening edge to hold those raw edges together. And I'm also going to edge stitch and just put a nice line of stitching all the way around the outer edge of my collar. I'm going to place some pins to hold these raw edges together. Sometimes when I've done this before, if you start at one end and stitch all the way across, you can end up pushing the fabric over as you go and ending up with kind of like a bit of bubble of fabric at the end. So a better approach is to start at the middle and stitch out, or start at the edge and stitch to the middle, and just do two sections of stitching. So starting from the edge to the middle and then again from the edge to the middle, and that just stops the fabric from moving. I'm going to use a long machine stitch and sew about 1 centimetre in from the edge. This is just to hold the fabric in position. Turning the machine back now to a regular stitch length of 2.5. I'm using the inner edge of the foot here as a guide. If you've got a hump jumper, something like this, you might find that is quite useful to place behind your presser foot so that the presser foot stays flat. Edge stitching done, now I can attach the collar to the neckband. Take your collar and we're going to match that to the neckband. If you've interfaced just one side, keep the interface side facing you. Be able to just look inside and see which one that is by looking within the seam allowance here. Or If you've got a preference for one side you think looks better with the stitching, choose that one to face outwards. So you'll find notches around the collar. Match the centre notch to the centre notch of your neckband, and then match the double notches as well. And then just continue to match the collar all the way around to the front of the neckband, and hopefully once you get to the end there, when the collar's put in position, the collar end will sit in the centre of the button stand. Take the neckband facing. This is the part that will sit on the inside of the shirt, and we'll prepare it first before sewing it in place by turning up the seam allowance all the way along the lower edge. Now I've pressed that edge, I'm going to trim away some of the seam allowance just to reduce the bulk for when this is attached to the collar. So I'll trim away about half, like we did on the other parts of the garment where we've trimmed seam allowance. And then take your shirt and place the neckband on top of the collar, so you're sandwiching the collar between the two neckbands, and you'll have both edges of the neckband pressed under like so. And we can start with matching notches. So I have a double notch here and another double notch here, so I can match those in place. And then just place pins all the way around, and that should match perfectly at the front because the neckbands are exactly the same size. And then we're going to sew this in place using 1.5 cm seam allowance, making sure that that's flush with this edge of the button stand, and we're going to just make a nice curve around each end and go all the way around, and then ending up flush here with the other button stand. Make sure you turn your stitch length back down to a regular stitch length of 2.5. If you're worried about sewing around this curve and getting it even on both sides, you could always just mark along the seam allowance a line for you to stitch along. Using a slightly shorter stitch length is also a good way to get a really smooth curve in your stitching. When you've finished, just check that your curved line of stitching is the same on both ends of your neckband. Because you want the neckband to be symmetrical, same as the collar. So you can just lay them on top of each other and just see if that's going to look the same. Turn it through to the right side, make sure it's going to be a nice curved line once that's pressed. And then when you're happy, we're going to trim away some of that seam allowance to reduce a bit of the bulk for turning through to the right side. So as before, we'll trim away about half of the seam allowance. Do that all the way along. Then we're going to layer the seam allowance a little, particularly around the area where you've got a lot of bulk here with the collar as well. So I'm just going to trim the neckband facing piece just slightly along here, just so that this will sit at a different height to the bulk of the collar. And then around the curve here, I'm going to clip up to the stitching line, and that will help the fabric to sit correctly when I turn it through. And I'll do the same the other end. And then we'll turn our neckband through to the right side, and I'm going to go over to the iron and then just press that in place, pulling the collar away from the neckband, pressing that nice and flat there, and then pulling this over as I go along, flattening the two neckband pieces so that they're going to sit together. Now I'm going to pin the neckband in place, making sure that the folded edge on the inside of the neckband facing just covers the stitch line from when I sewed on the original neckband. I want to make sure as well that any seam allowance here at the end is tucked in, or if you can't get it to tuck in, you can always just clip off a little bit of it to reduce that. I want to top stitch the neckband to echo the top stitching around the collar, but before I do that, to make sure that the top stitching is going to be perfectly placed, I'm going to hand stitch the neckband in place. Your pattern instructions will tell you to place these pins on the right side and then just to sew from the right side, but I don't find that my results always as perfect as I'd like it to be, so I prefer to do the hand stitching and then the top stitching. I've threaded up a needle and thread and tied a knot in one end, and now I'm going to slip stitch the neckband in place all the way along. I'll just remove that pin from there. I'm going to bury my knot inside here, so just go through the seam allowance and just leave your knot somewhere in there, and then bring your needle and thread right to the edge of the button stand. I'm going to catch the edge of my neckband here, just take a stitch through there and just bring that folded edge to the line of stitching that you can see here. Then I'm going to just go through the button stand just slightly below that line of stitching, and then where I come out of the button stand, I'm going to come opposite and into the neckband and go along the fold of the neckband, and then do the same where I've come out of the neckband, opposite and into the button stand. I'm going just through one layer of the button stand, so it's not going to be visible on the right side, and these stitches will be hidden. And then from the button stand back into the fold of the neckband, make a small stitch and carry on until you get to the edge of the button stand. And once you get to the edge of the button stand, you'll then be into just one layer of fabric. So what I'm going to do here, between here and the shoulder seam, is to sew as before, going through the folded edge of the neckband, and then I'm going to just catch a stitch from this line of stitching and then carry on. So back into the fold of the neckband along a little way, and then catch a stitch from this line of stitching. And I'm going to do that all the way to the shoulder seam. Now I've got to the shoulder seam, I've got lots of layers of fabric again, so I can go through the seam allowance here and sew through the seam allowance, making sure I'm really anchoring that stitching now, rather than just picking up a thread, which I was doing before. Once you're past the shoulder seam, we'll go back to how we were working before, going through the folded edge and then picking up a stitch, carrying on until I get round to the next shoulder seam. And now I'm round to the other shoulder seam, I can anchor my stitching to that seam allowance. And then just a small section to go before we get to the end. I'm back to the button stand again, so I can really anchor my stitching here into the fabric of the button stand, just going through the top layer and through the fold of my neckband. This is a very slow process, you might think, to hand stitch this neckband in place, but I do feel that this gives me the best result and the neatest finish. And when you get to the end, just make sure any seam allowance there is tucked into the neckband and take a few more stitches before fastening off. So for my final stitch, I'm just going to sew through the neckband, come out there, and just cut that off. And my next step will be to top stitch the neckband all the way around to echo the top stitching that I've done on the collar and on the button stand as well. The next stage in construction is to top stitch the neckband. I'm going to do this from the right side and start my top stitching somewhere near the back of the neckline, about here. You might find at the ends that you need to use a hump jumper, so make sure that the presser foot stays level as you sew over the end here. If you don't have one of these, you can make your own just by folding over bits of fabric. Top stitching done, and now on to the hem. But before I do the hem, I'm going to just go back and check that the fit of my garment is correct, and then when I'm happy with that, edge finish the seam allowances of the side seams and the sleeve. I've checked the fit of the garment, and so I will go ahead and do my edge finishing on the side seams. I'm going to trim off about 1/2 centimetre of the seam allowance as I go round. Next is the hem. I'm going to prepare the hem on the sleeves as well as the hem on the lower part of the garment. I'm going to do the hemming on both the sleeves and the lower edge of the garment. Before I do that, I'll just take my shirt to the ironing board and press my seam allowances of the side seams towards the back, and do that all the way along the shirt right to the end of the sleeve, so pressing them towards the back. And then I'm going to turn under the seam allowance on the sleeve by 2 centimetres. So I'll prepare and press that up all the way round, pressing up 2 centimetres, and on the lower edge I'm going to be turning this up by 1.5 centimetres. I've pressed up the hem at the lower edge by 1.5 centimetres, and I've now pressed up the sleeve seam by 2 centimetres. You might find it easier, especially along the bottom edge, to do as the pattern instructions say, which is to run a line of stitching 1.5 centimetres from the edge and then use that as a pressing line, a bit like we did on the yoke pieces. Once you've got that line pressed, I'm going to turn the raw edge in to meet the crease and then fold that over again to give a nice narrow hem, and I'll do that all the way along. You might find it easier to turn under the side seams first, so I'll start at the side seam there, turn that under, pin that in place, because where the hem is shaped it can be a little tricky to turn it evenly. Let's do this side as well, just trim off any threads that you don't need. Now if you find that this seam's quite bulky, what you can do is always trim off some of the bulk from in the inside. And now I've got the areas sort of pinned at the front and then at the side seam, I can work my way around this section here. I'm going to aim for the middle part first, get that in place, and then work on the middle section between the 2 pins. On the back piece, turn under the centre back first and then work your way round between the 2 sections, so from centre back to side seam, centre back. And then once the lower hem's done, you can work on the sleeves. If you're following the pattern for the longer sleeve, then you'll need to follow my other tutorial on how to attach the cuff. And now the hems are all pinned, I'm going to stitch them in place. I'm going to use the free arm on my machine and sew the sleeve hems first. Start from a seam here. And I'm going to try and keep my stitching an equal distance from the edge all the way around. Repeat for the other sleeve. And now I'll go around the lower hem. Before I do that, just make sure that both the front edges are the same length. So I'm just going to compare this edge with this edge and make sure that it's been turned up the same amount, and that if I line the front edges up, they're going to overlap in the same place. You don't want one hanging lower than the other. I might need my hump jumper again here just to get this line of stitching started. Now that I've sewn all the way around, I'm going to go back to the ironing board and give it a good press all the way around the lower edge and around the sleeve hems. Pressing's been completed, and I'm just going to add one of these little labels to the centre back. The next job is the buttonholes. Before you sew the buttonholes, just check that you're putting the buttonholes on the right side of the shirt. And when I say the right side, I mean the side that's correct for a man or a woman or whoever it is you are sewing for. I need the buttonholes on this shirt, which is going to be for my husband, to go on the left side as if he's wearing it. So that when it's done up, it will button left over right. I didn't trace off the buttonhole markings from the front band, so if you have done, then brilliant, but if you haven't, you can just go back to your pattern and then measure from the pattern. Just measure the distance between the buttonholes. I just measure from the top of one to the top of the other, and you'll find that it kind of varies depending on which size you use, from somewhere from 8 centimetres to 10 centimetres. Now you can choose the button placement that you want, and that might be dependent on the size of the buttons, how many buttons you have, or just personal preference. I'm going to go back to a shirt that I've made before where my buttonhole spacing is 8.5 centimetres apart, and then I can also measure where the top button starts. So I'm going to measure down on this shirt that I made previously. If I measure from my neckband to the top of my first buttonhole, that's 5.5 centimetres, and then the buttonholes are then spaced 8.5 centimetres apart. So I'm going to mark that onto my shirt. And when I'm marking the buttonholes, I'm just marking the top. I'm not going to worry about how big the buttonhole needs to be. I'm just going to worry about where the buttonhole needs to start each time. So I'll just use a pin for now to mark that spot. If you've got one of those buttonhole spacing devices, that would be really useful right now, because that's going to just mark them really quickly without you having to repeatedly measure in this way. That's going to give me 7 buttonholes, and then I'll also be putting a buttonhole into the neckband at the top, and I want that to go centrally parallel to this line here, starting from about here. So you don't want that buttonhole to come too far to the edge. Again, you can trace that off the pattern itself, because that will be marked onto the neckband, or you can just trace that off of a shirt that you already have. Now I've got the markings for all the buttonholes. I need to do a few testers first before I start putting the buttonholes onto this shirt. I have a 1-step buttonhole setting, so I've got one of these buttonhole feet where I place my button in the back, clamp it in position, and then attach the foot to the machine. And then there's a little lever on the side that pulls down into position, and then I need to set the machine up on the front here so that it's set to the buttonhole marking. And then make sure the stitch width is as wide as it can be, and the stitch length, I like to position that quite close to 0, but not on 0, else it's just not going to move. I'm going to do a test on 4 layers of fabric, because that's in some places what I've got on my front band there. So I can still see that there's a little bit of gap between my stitching, so I'm going to shorten my stitch length just a tiny bit to bring that in and make another test. And then just check that the buttonhole will fit the button. I like to make a hole and then use sharp scissors to cut, rather than just using an unpicker and running it the length of the buttonhole. Perfect. Okay. I'm going to make the one on the neckband first. This is the part where it can all go wrong, but just a word of warning, don't cut the buttonhole unless you're really happy with it, because once you've cut it, that's kind of final, but up until that point you can always unpick the stitching and re-sew it. My buttonhole will sew backwards, so I need to position the fabric ready for it to go backwards. Also, if you've got a one-step buttonhole setting on your machine, you'll need to reset before the next buttonhole, else it will just keep sewing in one spot. Okay, I'm happy with that. I'm going to cut the thread ends long because I like to just sew these in rather than cutting them straight off. I always worry about the thread coming undone, so I'll just show you at the end what I do to deal with all the thread ends. And now I'm going to work these buttonholes. So I've placed my pins at the spot where the buttonhole needs to start, but it's not exactly centered on the button stand. So if I measure the button stand, I can work out that the 1.5 centimetre mark is the centre of the button stand, and that's where I want all the buttonholes to sit. I just need to make sure that the button stand is centred when I'm sewing the buttonholes, and make sure that each buttonhole starts in line with each of the pins. And then, rather than cutting the threads, I'm just going to move all of this and then make the next one. Buttonhole's done. I'll just show you how I deal with the thread ends. So having done all the buttonholes in one long row, I need to just go along and just cut in between each one. So I'm going to cut the starting thread here, because I know that that starting thread is caught up with the ending threads. And then on the back, I'll just do the same thing. I'm going to take each of these threads through to the wrong side of the fabric using a needle. Sometimes you'll be able to turn to the back and just pull on the threads, and you'll find a loop of the thread that you can pull on, and it will bring the thread through to the back, but it doesn't always work. So I'm going to just transfer and then once that's transferred to the back, I can just take both of those strands and then I'm going to just run that through the thread to the buttonhole, and then just cut those off. I'm going to do that for all the buttonholes all the way down, and then also for my buttonhole at the top here. You might think this is a waste of time, so you can ignore this, cut the threads and then move on to the next stage. Now that I've dealt with all the thread ends, I need to cut open the buttonholes. I like to make a small hole in the middle with my unpicker and then cut with my scissors. And then just pull all the fraying bits and then just trim those off. And then repeat that. And then sometimes, to speed things up, I just make the hole with the scissors. If you end up doing this, like I've just have, take this back to the sewing machine, set your machine to a zigzag and just do a zigzag stitch the width of this to match your stitching here, just to fill in that gap. I'm going to fix that before I go on to the next stage. Check the zigzag stitch matches exactly by just turning the hand wheel so you can see where it's going to go in on either side of the stitch. I just turn down my stitch length so it's more of a satin stitch, and then I'm going to fill in that gap. The next part is to sew on the buttons and to mark the placement of those. I'm going to overlap the button stands and pin them in place as they would be when the garment's worn. Once you've got enough pins in to hold that button stand in place, then you can use more pins to mark where the buttons will be sewn on. Most people make the mistake of placing the button centrally in the buttonhole, which would be incorrect, because if you sew your button exactly in the middle, once that garment's worn, then the whole front there will just slip until the top of the buttonhole reaches the button. So we want to place the buttons about 3mm from the top of the buttonhole. So I'm going to put that pin in there to mark that position. On the button on the neckband, that one needs to sit close to the inner edge there, so about 3mm from the end of the buttonhole there. And then I'll just carry on down the button stand, marking the other buttons. Now I've done that, I can take out the pins and then undo the shirt, posting the pin that I've left to mark the button through the buttonhole and leaving it in the other side in the button stand to mark the placement of the button. What I find with this is quite often the pin marks the line at which the button needs to be sewn, but I'm not always exactly perfectly centred on the button stand, so I can use that marking to denote where, like the line at which that needs to sit, and then make sure when I sew the button on that it goes exactly central on the button stand. The final stage of the shirt is to sew on the buttons. You can do this on the sewing machine, and I'm sure it's a lot quicker, but I like to hand sew my buttons in place. You're going to need a cocktail stick or a toothpick or a needle that's quite fat, so a yarn needle or a bodkin or something, and a fine hand sewn needle, and then of course the buttons. Take a length of thread and then fold it in half. When I sew the buttons on, I'm going to use a double strand of thread. It's going to be a lot quicker to do it that way. I'm not going to tie a knot, I'm going to use the loop of the thread to form a knot once I start sewing. So take that loop through the eye of the needle. Make sure that the loop hangs lower than the ends of the thread. So that's the position I want my button to be in on the neckband. So I'll take my needle in the fabric and back out again, so just making a tiny little stitch there. I can take out the pin and then pull that through, and then as I do that, I'll then have the loop of thread here. Take the needle through that loop of thread, and that's going to secure my thread in place, ready to sew on the button. I'm going to anchor this a bit more sturdily by just sewing all the way through and making a tiny stitch there and coming all the way back again. Then I'm going to take my button and sew through the 2 holes of the button and then go back as best I can in exactly the right place on there. Now, once I've made that one stitch, I'm going to take my cocktail stick and place the cocktail stick through that loop underneath, like so, and then I'm going to use that cocktail stick as a spacer to create my thread shank. When I sew the button on, I want to make sure that there's going to be a space between the button and the fabric, so that once the button's in place, when I then go to do up the button and bring in that other layer of fabric between the button and the button stand, there's going to be enough space for it. So this acts as my spacer. I like to try and line my buttons up so that they always face the same way, so that the 2 holes will be either aligned. So the 2 holes will be aligned vertically or horizontally. So you can choose. You can see the 2 holes at the button there. I'm just going to sew over and over and over the button until I feel it is secure enough. Now, as I'm using a double thread, I think probably about four stitches will be enough. And then once you feel that that's enough, pull out your spacer and then bring the thread back up and underneath the button, and then just wrap the thread around. And then sew through the thread shank. Create a knot in your thread as you go. Give that a good tug. And then to fasten off, I'm just going to take my thread through the neckband, through the layers of fabric, and cut the thread there. So you'll see that the button stands slightly away from the fabric, and that just gives me enough space for the other layer of the button stand to sit beneath that button. Then you can test your buttonhole, check it works, check the button's in the right place. I'm going to work my way down the rest of the button stand, attaching the remaining buttons. Each time you'll start again with a new length of thread, making a loop, taking your thread loop through the eye of the needle, and then I can make a tiny stitch in and out of the fabric. At this point I want to just check that I'm going to be in the middle of the button stand, so that pin there is actually perfectly placed, and then use that loop of thread to anchor the thread in position, and then like before take one stitch all the way through and then all the way back out again, so that's really secure. Buttons are all sewn. I'm going to just check, make sure they're all in the right place. Perfect.